Okay, we're going to get started. We're a little early, which feels appropriate since election season starts earlier and earlier all the time. It's great to see everybody. Welcome. And thanks for joining us for this workshop. It's the very beginning of our Campaign 2020 series of workshops. So we're happy to see you guys. We will welcome your feedback so that we can make sure that we keep providing sessions that are valuable for working journalists. I'm Julie Moose. I should have said that first, probably. I'm Julie Moose. It's good to see you guys. I joined the National Press Club Journalism Institute as executive director almost 2 months ago, so a relative newcomer here. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Institute, which is probably most of you, God bless you. We are the nonprofit affiliate of the National Press Club, and we are responsible for advancing press freedom and helping to power journalism in the public interest. So I think that you guys have already met Crystal White, who is, I think, back out there, but thanks to Crystal for helping make this happen. And I want to introduce you to Diane Saenz, who was also a driving force behind this program. Diane is a longtime member of the National Press Club and has worked with nonprofits like Common Cause, represented here, and in newsrooms like the Washington Post. She's also an investigative researcher, and she will introduce our panelists in just a moment. But before we get started, I'm going to give the standard disclaimer about making sure you silence your phones. We encourage you to be on your laptops. We definitely want you to stay connected. We just want to make sure we're not interrupting the speakers with phones. So just be sure to silence your phones and follow along. If you don't have Wi-Fi, just sort of signal me. I'll bring the password around in case you can't see it from up there. And you have resources in front of you, and we will also email them to you after the program along with feedback so that you can tell us what worked for you and what you would like to see work differently next time. So with that, I will turn things over to Diane. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks again to the National Journalism Institute and specifically Julie and Crystal, who did so much work to make this happen. Campaign finance is the gateway to every other issue you and your audience care about, to paraphrase former FEC Commissioner Ann Revelle. So we think this issue is essential this year, especially as we head into the 2020 campaign. I'd like to introduce our speakers, who are all experts on this topic. To my left, Ellen Weintraub, Chair of the Federal Election Commission, who believes strong and fair regulation of money in politics is important to prevent corruption and maintain the American public's faith in their democracy. She has served the Federal Election Commission since 2002, 3 times as its chair. To Ellen's left is Paul Seamus Ryan, Vice President of Policy and Litigation for Common Cause. You may know him as the first to file a complaint about Michael Cohen's violation of campaign finance law to the DOJ and the FEC. Paul is an election law expert who's testified before Congress, the FEC, and state and local governments. He's litigated before many U.S. courts and was one of a few experts, along with Ellen, interviewed for a recent award-winning documentary called Dark Money. To Paul's left is Anita Kumar. Anita is White House correspondent and associate editor for Politico. Anita joined Politico this year after covering the White House for McClatchy newspapers for 6 years. She also worked for many years for the Washington Post and serves on the White House Correspondents Association board. And to Anita's left is Sheila Krumholz, Executive Director of the Center for Responsive Politics, which is home to OpenSecrets.org, a great resource which shines a light on campaign contributions, bankrolling federal politicians, lobbying expenditures of special interest groups, and the vast sums spent on political advertising. In 2010, Fast Company magazine named Sheila one of its most influential women in technology. So with that, we'll start. Ellen.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you and on such a distinguished panel, which also includes a number of my very dear friends in the campaign finance world. I completely agree with the opening comments that campaign finance is a critical issue. It affects everything: who gets elected, what gets enacted. And I also think it's going to be a compelling issue in the upcoming election. The last couple of elections have focused on issues of corruption, whether it's drain the swamp from the Republican side or end the culture of corruption and then adopt H.R. 1 on the Democratic side. It's clear that both sides recognize that talking about corruption and how the system is rigged in favor of those who have the big donors, those who have the most resources. This is an issue that resonates with voters and with the public, and I think it behooves all of us to pay a lot of attention to it. I want to say at the outset that when it comes to the press, I think that it is incredibly important that the FEC works with the press in order to make sure that the public has the best information. I try to be very available. Feel free to call my office, 694-1035 in Washington. I'm pretty responsive to reporters. Email me, follow me on Twitter. I think you've got my Twitter handle. And I will try and help you get the information to the public, because that is really the core of what we're all about. We are the agency that was set up to follow the money, and that is what we try to do. We collect an incredible trove of data. People like Sheila make really good use of it in doing added value analyses, presenting it to the public in a more accessible way. Paul has his own way of using the data in terms of filing complaints, but that's okay, because sometimes that's how the truth comes out also, and I've got a story about that. And we have, by the way, one of the best APIs in government. We collect all of this data, but it's also accessible to you, not only on our website and through resources such as Open Secrets, but you can also kind of suck the data out the back end and do your own analysis. And if you have interest in doing that, feel free to contact my office, and if you have trouble with that, we'd be happy to help you with that. So what are the hot issues in money and politics that we've been seeing? I think as the follow the money agency, the source of the money is always a big concern. Dark money continues to be an area of big concern, and people keep finding ingenious ways of finding ways around the disclosure rules. So we've seen it through C4s for a long time. More recently, the LLCs have become an interesting vehicle for dark money, and I don't know whether we're going to see something new and exciting in 2020, but I wouldn't be surprised. I think one of the interesting issues to watch is going to be the battle between small dollar donors and big dollar donors in the next election. There are a lot of candidates who are trying to leverage the power of grassroots, a lot of small donors. The Netflix theory, you subscribe every month and give a small amount of money. We saw it with the Bernie Sanders campaign, who famously ran a national campaign with an average contribution of $27. And I think there are a lot of candidates in this coming election who are going to be really interested in trying that model and trying to avoid the stain of the big, being too closely associated with the big money donors. On the other hand, the super PACs are there, and they're there to stay as long as the Supreme Court has its current composition, I believe. So we are going to continue to see them active, and they only get active at earlier and earlier points. What I saw recently, there are a couple of super PACs set up to oppose candidates. Already now have set up to oppose congressional candidates in the 2020 congressional election. That strikes me as early. I don't think that I've seen something like that before. That we've seen a lot of single candidate super PACs that have been set up to promote particular candidates, but I can't recall seeing something like this where super PACs were set up for the sole purpose of opposing a particular candidate, and as I said, this early in the cycle. So that may be a new innovation. I continue to be concerned about the role of social media and foreign influence, and these are related topics, as you will all understand. I think this is a topic that bears a lot of close watch, and I have a great example of a great recent example, for those of you who haven't already heard about this, of how sort of all these pieces have come together recently in one of the biggest cases that the FEC has had in years. It very recently became public that we have settled a case involving foreign money donations to the Right to Rise PAC, which was supporting Jeb Bush in the 2016 election. The combined penalties were close to $1 million, which is, a pretty hefty amount of money. We don't usually get that high. It's certainly the highest in the post-Citizens United era, and might be around the third highest ever. I can think of a couple of others, but don't quote me on that exact statistic, but I'll have to look it up. But I think it's about the third highest ever. And it involved a collaboration, really. It all came together as a result of a lot of people on this panel, frankly. The FEC had the data on its website on who was giving what to whom. Open Secrets took that data and put it in a more accessible form. In particular, they've got a page on corporate contributions to outside groups. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times expressing my concern about the possibility that foreign money could be coming in through corporations, that corporations might be being used as a vehicle for foreign-owned companies to funnel money from foreigners into U.S. elections. And a couple of enterprising reporters at The Intercept picked up on that concept and decided they were going to see if they could find a good, solid example of that. What they found, and they say they found it, the initial hit that triggered their interest, they found in 10 minutes flat by using Open Secrets data. So they then did a lot of good journalistic work and wrote a series of articles about this, involved foreign citizens who were on a board with Neil Bush, who were solicited for a contribution, and then the contribution, it was signed off on by a U.S. citizen at the domestic subsidiary, but the original solicitation and the interest had been expressed by the foreign owners who were not U.S. citizens. Paul Ryan read the series of articles, I think it was back when you were at CLC, right? And filed a complaint, which our lawyers picked up on and did further investigation and nailed down what I think is a pretty impressive settlement agreement. The details haven't entirely been made public, but the conciliation agreement has been made public. And I think it was good work all around, and should be a shot across the bow at companies who think that, well, as long as they have a lawyer who wrote a memo somewhere that said you're not allowed to have foreign money, that gets them off the hook, because they did have a memo like that, and it didn't get them off the hook. So I think this is a great example for all of you to, if you see something, if you hear something that sounds like, wow, there's probably more out there on this, dig into the data, because the data is a great source for you. And who knows, you could be the author of a story that results in the next $1 million penalty. And we're happy to have your help on helping us root out illegal conduct. So with that, I'll stop.
All Ryan.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. I am going to go through a list of 3 different general categories of things to look into that may reveal violations of campaign finance law. But first, I just want to mention my general attitude towards the work I do with journalists, the work I do with Chair Weintraub and the FEC and other law enforcement agencies. I really think that the integrity of our government depends on a symbiotic relationship between investigative journalists like all of you, who shine light on the actions of candidates and office holders, create the information that may serve as a red flag to nonprofit, nonpartisan watchdogs like myself and my colleagues at Common Cause. We know the law, we can spot violations easily, and we often turn your work into complaints where there's valid grounds for such complaints. And then law enforcement bodies like the FEC and the Department of Justice and corollary state and local agencies that hold political players accountable for their actions when they undermine our democracy. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but we got to keep fighting the fight to protect the integrity of our government. Common Cause has a website I wanted to pull your attention to. It's 2020candidatewatch.org. This is a site that we're using as a platform at this early stage of the 2020 presidential election to distinguish those who are actually declared candidates from those that are not yet declared, what rules apply to those who are declared candidates versus those who are just testing the waters or exploring candidacy. And the first report of an anticipated series of reports for that project, the 2020 Candidate Watch project, is in front of you. I've distributed copies. I have a few extras if you didn't get one and you want one or more to take with you. This report is about the first category of candidate or pre-candidate activities that sometimes reveal violations of federal campaign finance law. This is the testing the waters stage. And what is not often known by journalists is that the campaign finance contribution restrictions kick in as soon as someone starts actively exploring federal candidacy. They don't have to file any paperwork with the Federal Election Commission until they become a candidate, but even at that point, once they file their paperwork, when they become candidates, there's this kind of reach-back disclosure requirement. They have to disclose all the money they raised and spent to explore candidacy. This is an area that has seen a great amount of abuse over the decades, and this report in front of you goes into that detail, so I will spare you the detail this morning. I just want to give you the highest profile example of violations in this area, and that is Jeb Bush's 2016 presidential campaign launch. In December of 2014, Jeb Bush announced that he had, quote, decided to actively explore the possibility of running for president of the United States, kind of standard hedging language that pre-candidates use. And in January of 2015, Bush did something that had never been done before. He launched a super PAC. And it's important that under federal campaign finance law, it is illegal for a candidate to establish directly or indirectly a super PAC, any group that raises or spends money outside of federal contribution restrictions in connection with an election. But Jeb Bush said, I'm not a candidate, I'm not even testing the waters of candidacy, and he spent the next 5 months or so, 5.5 months, barnstorming the country, raised over $100 million in illegal to candidates money, big contributions, corporate contributions, et cetera. And in March of 2015, I filed a complaint with the Federal Election Commission on behalf of the Campaign Legal Center, alleging these violations of law, that Jeb Bush was actually a candidate at that point in denial, in violation of multiple campaign finance laws, including the laws that prohibit candidates from raising money for super PACs in excess of candidate limits, et cetera. That complaint is still pending before the Federal Election Commission, and Chair Weintraub will not be at liberty to discuss it, but I am constrained in no such manner. So once we get into Q&A, I'm happy to talk more about it. One of the reasons I published this report is because we've seen activities by these early candidates getting progressively more brazen over the years. I'm a little bit surprised that we haven't seen any really obvious violations of these laws yet in this cycle. Most of the high-profile Democrats have declared quite early. No glaring violations yet, in my opinion, in the 2020 cycle. But Joe Biden is maybe coming closest. He is still not yet declared. And at a dinner last weekend, or a couple nights ago, I think it was Saturday night, maybe Friday night, Delaware Democratic Party dinner, he declared that he has the most progressive record of anybody running. And then he added, trying to cure that that slip of his tongue or slip of his mask, anybody who would run. So I'm keeping an eye on Joe Biden to see if he might get into violation of federal campaign finance law territory here. So I thought coming into this election cycle, that might be an area for focused attention. Haven't seen too much along the lines of blatant violations yet. The second area that I would encourage you as journalists to focus on is candidate involvement with outside groups. And this is an area where we're already seeing problems in the 2020 cycle. I'll give you some examples of past problems, though, and then also mention some current election cycle problems. Again, Jeb Bush and the Right to Rise super PAC. I think his very creation of that PAC and fundraising for it violated federal law that was passed back in 2002 as part of the McCain-Feingold law. Hillary Clinton campaign and the super PAC Correct the Record. I left the Campaign Legal Center in October of 2016. The last complaint I helped file there was against Clinton and Correct the Record, alleging illegal coordination. In November of 2017, Donna Brazile, in promotion of a book she was publishing at the time, stated publicly and in some interviews that the Clinton campaign controlled the DNC's expenditure of DNC funds raised through joint fundraising operations, and that could be a violation. There are limits on how much a party can spend in coordination with its own candidates. And an interesting thing to keep an eye on in the 2020 cycle are Democratic presidential candidates who have already begun disavowing the support of super PACs in the primary, but are leaving themselves some room to nevertheless welcome the support of those same super PACs in the general election cycle. If their reason for disavowing super PACs in the primary is sincere, if they really think big money to super PACs can corrupt our democracy, then why will that money all of a sudden become okay with them in the general election? I'll leave it to you to ask them those questions.
1 minute.
Okay, thank you. And one example of the very great significance when a reporter is able to connect outside group spending with a candidate's own, the candidate himself or herself or candidate staff, is the Michael Cohen, Stormy Daniels, Karen McDougal, American Media Inc. hush payments. The Wall Street Journal, I believe in October of 2016, had reported that Stormy Daniels had been paid by someone to stay quiet, but they had no connection to anyone on Team Trump. It wasn't until January of 2018 that the Wall Street Journal realized through some great investigative reporting that Michael Cohen's name was on an LLC set up in Delaware that was used to make the payment to Stormy Daniels. Within a couple days, I filed complaints with the DOJ and the FEC alleging these violations of federal law for these hush money payments. And then in February of 2018, Ronan Farrow published a piece in the New Yorker connecting, or at least indicating that Karen McDougal had been paid a hush payment by American Media Inc., the National Enquirer. He made no connection in that piece to Michael Cohen, but I had seen that Maggie Haberman of the New York Times that morning had tweeted Ronan Farrow's story. I sent her a message via Twitter. I have no idea if she read my message. I've never heard back from her. But what I said in the message was, hey, if there's a connection to Michael Cohen or anyone else on Team Trump, this is another major campaign finance law violation. 2 days later, Maggie Haberman and her colleagues at the New York Times published a piece on a Sunday connecting Michael Cohen to AMI. AMI, David Pecker, they reached out to Michael Cohen when AMI was considering the payments to Karen McDougal. So next day was President's Day. I spent it in my office drafting a complaint, filed it that Tuesday. So that's one example of good investigative journalism, meeting up with my watchdogging efforts, the efforts of other watchdogs like me, to produce a criminal prosecution. Michael Cohen's now going to prison. And I'm out of time, so the third thing I was going to mention was accurate donor disclosure. And I'll only mention one thing, which is keep your eyes peeled for a complaint I'm filing this afternoon in response to a New York Times story on Saturday afternoon about a woman named Cindy Yang seemingly using straw donors to contribute to the Trump Victory Fund last year. And I'm happy to talk more about that and other donor disclosure issues during our Q&A. Thank you.
Well, I know I'll keep my eyes peeled.
Thanks, Paul. Anita Kumar.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I see some familiar faces. I'm going to sort of switch gears a little bit and talk about very practical things that you can look at. We all want to write the Michael Cohen story. We're not always going to do that. So just things that you can look at. There is a lot of good stories to be done that maybe, don't rise to that level, but there's a lot of things you can do with the data. So I know that a lot of us end up, I think I'm like you guys in that I've covered a lot of campaigns, but I have not covered campaign finance as a full-time job. So I'm just looking for good stories that I can do that are different. Generally, everyone tends to write the same sort of story when the campaign finance reports come out, which there's nothing wrong with saying how much someone raised or someone spent. But if you take a minute to look when the reports are actually filed, or call someone like Sheila, who I call very often, you can find some other things. So I just wanted to go through a list of things that I have looked at, or I know other people have looked at. Some will seem basic, some not so basic, on where you could possibly find stories. And then I was going to go through some stories from the last few years that kind of take those things and make them practical. So on the money raised part, which is really what everyone tends to focus on more than how it's spent, obviously you want to look at how much is raised. That's the number one thing. But, sort of, did the person put in their own money? Was it a loan or a contribution? If you'll remember, Donald Trump said he would put in money last time, and he did put in, but not quite as much as he said. Small donors are going to be a big deal this cycle, and so I think that people can talk about how to determine what a small donor is and how to really look at that. Everyone will say that they have the record number of small donors. But you can sort of, how you can fact check it, maybe Sheila can go over that, how you can really look at, did that person have that? In state or out of state, did the person get money from which state, which zip code? If it happens to be someone running for Congress, you could look at how many donations came from, or how much money came from another state. High profile donors that you might see. Just big names, just looking for people in the, friends, big people, corporate people, finance people. Did someone bundle money for them? And if you don't know how to look up how someone reports on bundling, we can kind of talk about that. Which industries are the biggest? What money came from PACs? And then, the big question is, why are people donating? I think that's the thing that is kind of overlooked. So on the money spent, what did they spend it on? Do they have any debts? Did any family members get paid? Who are some of the vendors? And then just sort of the patterns or trends in spending. One thing I hadn't thought about, but one of my colleagues did last year, was looked at during the midterms, if candidates for Congress were using the same vendors as Donald Trump, if Republicans were using the same vendors to kind of say, it was kind of an interesting idea, I'd never thought of that, to say sort of, here's the Trump magic for 2016, are they trying to get that same thing? It was kind of an interesting take, and it was hit or miss, it depended on the Republican. So I just wanted to go through some of the stories. A lot of stories that we tend to see get the big headlines are, one number. So one number really stands out. If you'll remember back from, I think this was 8 years ago, I still remember this, the John Edwards $400 haircut. Do you all remember that? I looked that up last night to talk about where that came from, and it turns out, I did not remember this. It was actually Politico, way before my time, that wrote it. It was this small. It was like a blog post at the time, and it was the Obama campaign that pointed it out to them, so it was kind of funny. But clearly you can find those things. Another number from the last cycle that I remember this story is National Journal wrote a story about Rand Paul paying $100,000 to secure the domain name randpaul.com before he launched. And I just remember there were a lot of raised eyebrows about $100,000, but it was what a interesting thing to look at. You can also look at some of the numbers to fact check what the candidate says. If you remember, Hillary Clinton in 2016 kept talking about how she was a good Democrat and was contributing a certain amount of money to Democratic candidates and the DNC. And there was a lot of controversy about whether she really did that. And I know a couple people really dug into that to say, here's how much she really contributed. If you remember, that was a big point of contention between Sanders and Clinton. I think the best stories, though, to look at are sort of the stories that show the trend on a campaign. So, for example, for Hillary Clinton, how did she spend the money? I actually did a story, and I think the AP also did a story about, she was raising all that money and she was spending a lot of money. And if you really looked at what she was spending it on, really early on, she was spending it to hire all these staffers, which is not unusual. But the staffers were dispatched to all 50 states, which is kind of unusual, right? You're usually in the early states. And so I did a story, and others did a story about how in the early days they were spending a lot of money on like places like Oklahoma and Hawaii, places you would not think campaigns were spending money. And it was really interesting because it really showed what her campaign was focused on, and I think those are sort of the better stories. I pulled a story that actually Sheila's people helped me with last cycle. I didn't know what would come of this, but they actually ran the numbers to show, did Obama and did Clinton, was Clinton getting the same number, let's see, the bundlers, were the bundlers the same for Obama and Clinton? So why this was interesting is this was sort of Obama's heir apparent. He endorsed Hillary Clinton, and they're both Democrats. You would think they would have sort of the same people giving the money, and the answer was they didn't. So they could look at the bundlers for Obama and the bundlers for Clinton to see that they were actually really different people. So both of them had the rich friends, but they were different rich friends.
1 minute.
1 minute, okay. Couple other things. More recently, Donald Trump, for any of those of you that are covering Donald Trump, something really good to look at is how he's spending money at his own properties. There have been several stories about that, but there's a lot of detail there, particularly if you're interested in a particular property or particular state. Also, you can look at if the candidates spend money at his properties. There was a story done last year and the cycle wasn't even over yet, it was from August, that 125 Republican campaigns had spent money at his properties, so hosting fundraisers or going out to dinner or whatever. And why that was interesting is that in 2014, in that cycle, the amount of money was $35,000 that the Trump properties had gotten. In last year's cycle, it was $3.5 million. So there was a reason for that, obviously. And then the last kind of type of story is sort of that you can take some of the numbers and look at the candidate in a little bit of a different way. NBC did a really good story about how Bernie Sanders last time was saying, and he is still saying, that he's the guy that's for the people, and he has all these grassroots people giving him $5 and $10. They actually did a story that took them beyond the numbers, that said he had actually gone to a ton of these high donor, ritzy fundraisers, which was really against the grain, right? You wouldn't think that about him. So that took reporting that wasn't the numbers, but actually talking to people about how he attended these other fundraisers. But I thought it was really interesting. There's a lot of stories like that. I did a story, actually. I found the people that President Trump gave money to, which Republican candidates he gave money to during the midterms, and I looked up those people and realized they weren't Trump people. They were people that actually didn't like Trump at all. They opposed him on policy. They were Republicans. They opposed him on policy, but he gave them money anyway. So those were kind of against the grain, took another level of reporting. There's a million good stories out there. I just wanted to kind of get you thinking about other stories that you can do. And then I'm going to just close on one thing that's my pet peeve, which is we've kind of gotten the habit that fundraisers for candidates are closed. They actually used to be open. And President Bush, George W. Bush, opened many of his fundraisers, and President Obama opened his fundraisers, a part of them anyway, or not the Q&A, but the remarks. And now it's sort of a given that they're going to be closed. President Trump closes his fundraisers. Hillary Clinton did the same thing, and I think if you're out there on the campaign trail, you should be asking if someone can get in and why we can't get in if you're there.
Thanks, Anita. Sheila.
Or just inviting yourself in, as I remember James Grimaldi and Tom Edsall did back in the day of Team 100.
They crashed?
I believe
They crashed.
They crashed some
It's hard to crash now.
And as you were mentioning the following the expenditures of John Edwards, that reminded me of something Bob Bierzak, longtime FEC employee who is a senior fellow at the Center for Responsive Politics, recently said to me. He said, one evening, Jean Cummings, I don't know if she was at Bloomberg or Wall Street Journal or where she was, but he called her up. She called him up and said, they bought her clothes. And he said, what? They bought her clothes. And she was speaking, of course, about Sarah Palin's Neiman Marcus spending spree, compliments of the RNC. So you can find gold in deep in the data if you're willing to mine it. So yes, I'm going to be, I think, a little more brief. I hope you're all familiar with Open Secrets, but it's our site where we aim to produce peerless data on money and politics. The bailiwick is our standardization and classification by industry of individual donations, but we track all campaign donations and expenditures, so classifying those as well. There are certainly times when I would say don't go to Open Secrets, go to the FEC. If it's right after a filing deadline and you want to get the data before it's been hauled in and grokked by our researchers, that's where you want to go to cherry pick and get the goods. But I would encourage you to stay in touch with our small but mighty team, because we do have specific experts that are focused laser-like on different parts of the data, and certainly our press at crp.org can tell you what is available in terms of how recently it's been grabbed from the Federal Election Commission or other public data sets, and when it is next going to be updated, so that if you're writing a story using data on Open Secrets, you can be sure that it's not about to be replaced with more recent data. So pay attention throughout our website to the footnotes, which detail when the data was downloaded from the Federal Election Commission or other public records, and when it was, and what period it covers, because those are very different, and I'll get to that in my remarks later when we're walking through the Open Secrets website. So the two places that I think CRP data really delivers value to reporters on campaign donations are the donor disambiguation. So talking about donors who've given to multiple candidates, maybe opposing candidates, or flipped from one candidate who loses in the primary or in the general even, and then flips to their opponent to get in good with whoever is likely to win or has won. That's the kind of thing that we can easily show you because we are looking at every single itemized donation and kind of fingerprinting them, so that we can group up all related individual donors and donations, regardless of whether or not it is easy to make the connection. And that goes not just for a unique individual, but also their family unit. That is also the kind of thing that we're able to connect to the lobbying data. So a lot of these presidential candidates and other candidates are disavowing not only corporate PAC donations and super PAC donations, but even money from lobbyists, registered lobbyists. And that's the kind of thing that we can easily connect and show you exactly whether or not they are, in fact, getting money from lobbyists. Many folks are doing essentially the work of lobbyists without registering, but for those that are federally registered, you can easily fact check whether or not they're keeping to their vows. And again, whether they're giving to, as the example of donors, whether or not they're giving to both Obama and Clinton. That's the kind of thing that we can easily do, because we're tracking each and every donation. And then categorization by industry, so that when you're looking for doing a story about a candidate who's talking about Wall Street or talking about oil and gas or fossil fuels, you're easily able to see whether or not they are collecting money from those sources. Important to note that they may be getting money from individuals associated with that industry. That was a big story in the last election cycle with Beto O'Rourke, who was taking money from individuals associated with the oil and gas industry, being from Texas, not surprising, but saying that he was not, because he was not accepting PAC donations. And our whole data set is organized based on the occupation and employer of individual donors. So if you are interested only in looking at the PAC donations, that's fine, we have that too. But for individual donors, if you're missing that money, you're missing, in some cases, in some industries, the vast majority of the support coming from that industry or company. So we certainly have the ability to make that accessible to you so you can see exactly the source of the money, but that's something to keep in mind. And finally, we also track, speaking of the Trump properties, the who is spending money at Trump properties on our website in the Trump section. Beyond that, I just wanted to make sure that you are keeping in mind as you're writing these stories the kind of trends that have shifted how money is being deployed. And so I want to go over some kind of top line numbers. In 2018, we found that that was the most expensive midterm election ever, and by a very wide margin, totaling more than $5.7 billion, way up from $3.8 billion in 2014, the last midterm election cycle, and even surpassing the $5.3 billion spent on the then record-breaking 2008 presidential elections. What propelled this? We think that loosened regulation and oversight that Ellen and Paul were discussing contributed to the flood of money, but also, of course, competition. 2018 saw a huge groundswell of challengers. Candidate spending grew by more than $1 billion over the previous midterm election cycle, resulting in record-breaking spending in several races, including outside spending. The Florida race, for instance, surpassed $209 million in total spending, which blows away the previous record. And 2018 saw 9 of the 10 priciest House races ever, not counting special elections. So 9 of 10 most expensive ever.
1 minute.
Thank you. The high cost of victory rose higher in 2018, so the new tally is it costs on average $15.7 million to wage a winning Senate race, up from $12.2 in 2016, and just over $2 million to wage a winning House race, up from $1.5 million in the prior cycle. Non-party outside spending also saw huge growth, ballooning 84% over the past midterm election cycle to nearly $1.1 billion. And overall, the Democrats held the advantage, $300 million spending advantage that, of course, helped them retake the House. Early departures played an important role, and we have a new page on our site that details that and shows over time how unusual the 2018 cycle was, with Republicans in the House bailing in record numbers. 33 GOP members either retired or sought another office, not counting those who had left and were replaced during the cycle. That's the highest number of Republican retirements from the House in at least 30 years. And in partisan terms, we saw the Democrats take the House, ushering in a far more diverse class of freshmen, making the 116th Congress the most racially and ethnically diverse in history. 90% of non-white members are Democrats. By the way, today we will be releasing a study on race and gender of candidates and a new section of our website, I believe to coincide with that today or certainly this week. So look for that. And beyond that, we'll be talking about some of the other important trends in terms of where the money came from, the surge of small donors, the surge in mega donor donations. 10 of the most generous mega donors combined to pour $445 million into this election, into the 2018 election. Big self-funders who usually lose big won, in many cases last cycle, which was unusual, and that, of course, may signal good news for Howard Schultz, I don't know. And small donors delivered more than $1 billion, up from $641 million in 2014. And the big trend in in outside spending was that dark money, that is non-disclosing nonprofits and other hidden sources like shell companies and LLCs, dropped, but partially disclosing organizations surged, and all told more than $539 million was spent by groups that do not fully disclose their donors. And also last year saw a surge in liberal dark money spending. The top dark money group spending money was, for the first time, a liberal organization. I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks to you all for great opening remarks. Our goal is to make this as interactive and valuable to you as possible. So we're going to break here, take about 4 questions, maybe 5, if you're brief, and then pivot back to Sheila for a demo of Open Secrets and some of the new data sets and resources that the Center for Responsive Politics has to offer you. So please raise your hand and we'll call on you. Just a reminder, this is being recorded for posterity. We prefer to have working journalists ask the first questions, please. So identify yourself and your affiliation before asking your question.
While I find the first question, while somebody raises their hand to identify as asking the first question, I'd love for the panelists to talk a little bit about what voters are most concerned about. So as you do this work, what are some of the things that you hear and understand concern voters most about campaign finance?
Okay. Any questions? Yes, woman.
I'm Kimberly Adams. I'm with Marketplace. And Commissioner, I was wondering if you could talk. Oh, sorry. See you back there. Kimberly Adams with Marketplace Radio. Commissioner, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why you're particularly concerned about LLCs.
Do you want to collect a few, or do you want me to just launch?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. So, because they're dark, you know, the one of the problems with super PACs is that they can collect corporate money. So that becomes a vehicle for shielding the identity of the real donors. And some of them are very ingenious. I mean, we've seen some very intricate plots that involve moving money from an LLC to a C4 to a super PAC and then back out the door and then over to another super PAC. And there are plainly efforts underway by some very sophisticated players to hide the source of the money. And it takes a lot of investigation to uncover who's really behind it. And that's ultimately what the voters are entitled to know. You know, I hate Citizens United, 97% of it, but there are 3 really great pages in there that talk about how important it is to an informed electorate to have this information about where the money is coming from. So that's my big concern with the LLCs, is that they shield the sort, you know, we often don't know who's behind them. Now, sometimes people like you can flush that out. Sometimes the donors are, you know, you get 2 categories. They're the ones who are really ingenious and doing everything they can to hide their identities. But then there's another class of donors that are, you know, kind of rich guys who would prefer not to disclose who they are, but they're not, you know, they don't want to look like they're, you know, big secretive bad guys. So there have been instances where the press went after some of these LLCs and said, you know, there was $1 million donation. I can remember this happened in the Mitt Romney campaign, for example. You know, $1 million donation that came in through some shadowy organization, which basically means we don't know who's behind it. And the donor, you know, came forward and said, oh, that was me. I thought that was okay for me to do it that way, so I did it that way, but really, I wasn't trying to circumvent the law, so he just kind of came forward. And sometimes, you know, just by virtue of writing a story, you can flush them out.
Oh, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, just I think the really problematic LLC money is when an LLC is created for the purpose of laundering funds into an election context. And that, I think, is pretty much what happened with the example Chair Weintraub was just alluding to. And the LLC was W. Spahn LLC. The donor, $1 million donor to the Romney supporting super PAC's name was Ed Kennard. And a story was published on a Friday. I filed a complaint with the FEC that afternoon, and the next morning Ed Kennard admitted that it was his money. And the timing of the events is what triggered the complaint from me. This was a LLC that was set up, and within, I think, a month and a half, it had somehow amassed $1 million that it gave to a super PAC, and then it was shut down within a week of making the contribution. It was just laundering money. The Supreme Court has said for decades that American voters have a right to know who's contributing and spending money to influence their vote on election day. This matters. Even the conservative Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld this right of American voters. That's, to me, why LLCs matter and are a troubling evolution in campaign finance activities.
Does anybody else want to weigh in?
I just wanted to add, there was an article, I believe, a week ago about LLC donations to the Trump inauguration that identified at least 3 foreign individuals, one of whom appears not to be a legal resident or have a green card. So that was identified as a potential illegal donation, coming, at least in one case, through an LLC based in Wayne, Pennsylvania, representing an individual from India who is a real estate financier with overlapping business interests with the Trump organization. So I think there is, again, there are great stories buried in the data that can only be, in some cases, revealed by doing that digging into the, the PO boxes and the, which other organizations are also registered at that same address, as was the case in that story.
And since you're aware this is an issue, is there going to be increased enforcement focused on LLCs this year?
Our enforcement program is largely complaint-driven, so it kind of depends on what complaints come in the door. One of my focuses as chair, we've got a huge backlog right now. There are a bunch of cases that have been held up by commissioners for years, and that is very troubling to me. And some of them are reaching statute of limitations, drop-dead dates, so that's even more troubling. And I am going to do my best to try and move those cases out into the public arena. If the commission can't agree on the result, complainants can sue us and say, hey, when we can't agree on the results, what that usually means is one of my colleagues and I think we ought to enforce the law or investigate or do something, and 2 commissioners don't think so. There should be 6 of us, but there's only 4 right now. So the complainant at that point can sue us, take us to court to challenge that determination not to move forward because we don't have 4 votes to move forward. And sometimes that will force the commission into action that we did not initially have the votes to pursue. There's also the possibility of delay suits, and honestly, I'm surprised that we don't get more of them because there are some cases that plainly have been delayed by anybody's. When a complaint is filed and the statute of limitations is about to run and the commission hasn't done anything yet, seems to me that's a prima facie case for a delay suit, but which would be another way that somebody could try and force action at the FEC. But I'm going to do what I can to move the cases out. It's not entirely within one commissioner's control.
Thank you. Okay, other questions?
Hi there, my name is Natalie Brand. I'm a freelance reporter with CBS NewsPath. My question, you touched on bundling. What new trends are you seeing with regards to bundling, especially as there's a rise in small donor donations?
Is that to me, to Paul? Anybody? Did you intend that for one of us in particular?
We are always looking for bundling that is representative not just of families, as I'd mentioned, but also bundles that are represent an anomaly for contributions coming from a single organization, like a business from which we had never seen donations before. So I think that's always a good thing to be on the lookout for and can be queried for a new cycle. So we don't, of course, have data yet. We won't have the first quarter data. That won't be filed until April 15th, after which we'll grab it. But that's something that you can be on the lookout for, is a new entity popping up. Sometimes it may be a new organization, but sometimes it's just a newly politicized organization, as I've seen in the past. And of course, we've had great stories from reporters working there, calling up these individuals and saying, why did you make these donations, and getting great quotes from people who had no idea they made those donations, even children who've had those no idea they made donations and have been coached on how to reply. So I think bundling is, there are lots of ways to tackle it, but it remains to be seen how we will, how it will be revealed this new cycle.
There's one new bundling-like practice. There's one newly evolved campaign fundraising practice that's worth mentioning here. Normally, when we talk about bundling, we're talking about one individual collecting up the contributions to a single recipient from a bunch of different contributors and then delivering it, to give the impression that this individual who's doing the delivering is making a $1 million contribution instead of a $2,700 or $2,800 contribution that they're allowed to make under the law. A new development in the last presidential cycle was sort of a bundling together of the recipient committees by the parties. These are now being referred to as super joint fundraising committees. Sheila's website tracks these groups. Hillary Clinton was the first to do this, and and this all became possible because of the Supreme Court's decision in a case called McCutcheon v. FEC. Before that decision, there was a limit of about $120,000 total that one donor could give to all federal political committees. The Supreme Court declared that unconstitutional. So Clinton in 2016 put together the DNC, her own campaign committee, and I believe it was 32 or 33 state party committees, all of which have their own $10,000 limit, and there's no limit on transfers between these state party committees and the DNC. So in effect, they were able to hit up one donor for, instead of a DNC contribution, a Clinton campaign contribution, add another $300,000 to that, or more. I mean, you could get into the millions of dollars from a single donor, and the money was electronically, instantly transferred from the Joint Fundraising Committee to the state party committees back to the DNC. And then, according to Donna Brazile, the Clinton campaign controlled how all this money was spent from her Brooklyn headquarters. So that's kind of a bundling of recipient committees in a way that allows contributions feasibly in the millions of dollars per donor to federal committees, asked for by a single candidate for president.
I'll just say that I'm much more concerned. Traditional bundling is bundling of legal contributions to candidate committees, and it's not so much to make it look like somebody is giving a larger donation than they are, but to show that they've got the ability to raise that much money, and therefore they're somebody that the campaign ought to pay attention to when they have concerns. That's the corruption side of the story that we'd want to be concerned about. The post Citizens United, bundling became less of a thing because people could just write their own $1 million checks to super PACs. I think in the last cycle there were, see if I got these numbers from Sheila's website, see if I get them right, because I'm going off memory, but I think there were something like 126 individuals or families that gave over $1 million, and 10 that gave over $10 million, or maybe a dozen who gave over $10 million, and one family that gave over $100 million. And I think those, and if you look at the top donors on Sheila's website, she makes it really easy to find. You can run down that list and you'll see a couple of names that you've heard of, and a lot of names that are not household names at all. And I think that's a really interesting area for reporting, because people who are giving at that level, they do have influence. They get their phone calls returned by Democrats, by Republicans, it doesn't matter who they're giving to. If they're giving at that level, anybody's going to take their calls. And I think drawing more attention to that and casting more sunlight on who those people are who have that vast amount of influence is a great area for reporters to be looking at.
And also to look at what they want, because they want something. Just all the policy that they would be looking at and trying to get, or just things that they're interested in. There was a great story that ProPublica did, a really deep dive into Sheldon Adelson and all the things that he wanted from Donald Trump that I thought was really great.
Frank Lockwood with the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. I have a question for you. Why are candidates in this day and age allowed to say, we took this money from this donor, we don't know where they're from or what they do, and they're able to say best efforts? Why is that allowed, especially if very often Googling wasn't part of their best efforts. You could just Google them and find out.
You know, that is one of many questions that, I mean, in part because the law says that, you know, as long as they make best efforts, they've satisfied the legal standard. What constitutes best efforts is something like many issues that commissioners disagree about on the FEC. Whether someone should be held to the standard of, you know, the high standard of Googling to make best efforts. I mean, and not to discount the, you know, there are a lot of people who have the same name, right? So it's not as easy as just Googling to find somebody, because there's a lot of people named Frank out there. And I know there's more than one person out there with my name. There's more than one person on Twitter with my name. There's more than one person on Facebook with my name. And I continue to get alumni mail from the University of Arizona. They are convinced that I went there, and I never did. Somebody named Ellen Weintraub went to the University of Arizona. It wasn't me, but I can't seem to convince them. So, you know, it's not... I don't want to oversimplify the difficulties of figuring out exactly who these people are, but I agree with you that we could probably uphold a higher standard of best efforts if we had the votes on the FEC to do so.
Anyone else? We're going to pivot now to Sheila Krumholz, who's going to make a no longer than 20-minute presentation, and then we're going to use the remaining time for your questions as well. We just thought it would be valuable to you to get a sense of all Open Secrets has to offer. Okay, Sheila.
Great, thank you. I think you all have one worksheet with 2 sides on tracking dark money. I'm not going to go over that, but it's tips for tracking dark money and resources for tracking dark money, with a contact email for Anna Masolia, our CRP nonprofits and FARA researchers. So I hope that you'll look that over, and if you have questions about digging into...
We're going to email that to you.
Excellent.
I don't think we made hard copies of it.
Okay. And even better, because it's full of links that you'll want to be able to use. So look for that. But what I wanted to do was take you on a tour of our website, looking at this sheet, which I know you do have in front of you, which again is full of links. The top part is Open Secrets quick links, which are some of the, I think, the juiciest sources for data that you should be aware of, again, providing context as you're doing some of these stories. But the part I'm going to focus on now is just taking you through 2020 presidential candidate comparison, looking at Warren and Sanders. So here I say some questions you may want answered: small donors, which candidate has received the most from small donors; women, which has received the most from women donors; Wall Street, who gets more money from Wall Street, or for that matter, any industry, essentially who's more likely to reach the much desired progressive base; and expenditures, how are they spending this money, which vendors are benefiting. So looking at small donors, you can find on Open Secrets, here I'm clicking on the very first link, and you can do this along with me if you have a laptop by going to the link at the top of the page. It's simply http://crp.org/8. But again, that is on the sheet that was passed out. So clicking on the very first link under small donors, this is Elizabeth Warren's 2018 race profile. And again, we don't have a 2020 race profile yet for her, because we don't have the 2020, they have not filed yet their 2020 data. But you can look back and see for many of these people what they were doing in prior cycles, including for Sanders and others in prior presidential cycles. So you scroll down to the source of funds on her landing page at the bottom, and you will see small individual contributions of less than $200 amounted to $19.5 million last cycle. Not bad for a virtually uncompetitive race, with nearly 56% of that money coming from small individual contributions, those of less than $200 or less. Now, how does Bernie compare? So this should make it trivial for you to do this kind of comparison. And I just want to kind of clue you in, if you aren't already aware, to these places, standard places on profiles that allow you to do this kind of a comparison. So again, Sanders was just re-elected in 2018 as well, and you can see his page here, and at the bottom of that landing page, 75, nearly 75, a little more than 75% of his money came from small donors, but less in total dollars, only $8.9 million. Of course, he raised quite a bit less. You can also look at his funds for the presidential profile to get a sense of what is more likely to occur in a presidential context. And there we saw $135 million, an astonishing 57.7% of his funds coming from small individual contributions. So that's the kind of thing that you will see on every single member profile, every presidential profile, and every candidate's profile on a race, in the context of a race. Below that, you can also, and for comparison in 2016, so 57.7% from small donors for Sanders. By comparison, Clinton raised $100 million from small donors, so less than him, all told, which is just under 20% of her funds from small donations, and Trump raised about $87 million, or just under 26% of his funds from small donors. So his campaign is ballyhooed as this incredible small donor funded campaign, but in fact, just 26% of his funds came from small donors. Not bad, but not nearly as good as Sanders and others. Okay, on to the second question. Which received more money from women donors? So I wanted to first go over our overall donor demographics, so you have a sense of, again, the context. So looking at election overview for our whole site, you will see here on the left-hand nav bar donors, and the first item is donor demographics. So this takes advantage of the work we do to categorize each itemized individual donor by gender, and to disambiguate each person's donations. And so here you see at the top, at a glance, less than 0.5% gave 71% of the money. Less than 0.5% of the U.S. population giving $200 or more delivered the vast majority of the money. And when we scroll down, you can look at that by gender and see where we're at. In 2018, well, we're at 36.9% of the donors, itemized donors are women, giving just 29% of the money. Of course, that's much improved from years past. 2018 was, I think, yet again another year of the woman. How many have we had so far? But that's where you get the context. And now going back to Sanders and Warren, you can look at that just for their campaigns and see that for Elizabeth Warren, she had 50.7% of her itemized donations coming from women, which is a very high rate. We had a number of Senate candidates and about 4 dozen House candidates in 2018 raised more than half of their money from women, delivering, in her case, $8.2 million. And then comparison for Sanders, let's look, raising 41%, so less in terms of the portion, more in terms of the amount. Now, this is just itemized donations. We are unable to see or tell what the demographics are for race or gender. For unitemized donations, we do think, given that in comparison, women's donations are smaller, that there's a good rationale that the unitemized donations are proportionally higher in terms of the money coming from women, but we have no means of fact-checking that. So moving on to Wall Street. Probably neither of them got very much, but let's review the ways you can verify this. So first, go back to Warren's profile and look at her top 5 industries tab. So on the summary page, you see, among other items, her top 5 contributors and her top 5 industries. And you do not find finance there, but you can click on top industries or go to the top industries, the industries tab, and see here that, in fact, securities and investment, CRP's category for Wall Street, is among her top 20 sources by industry. Giving 358,000, all but 5,000 of that coming from individuals, and 5,000 coming from PACs. That is likely a contribution that was made and recorded by the PAC, but it is likely to have been returned. So you should know that when you're looking at PAC information on our website, it is what's being reported by the PACs, not the candidates. There are dozens of candidates who say we do not take PAC money, but you will see in some cases small amounts, typically, of corporate PACs showing up on their profile, and that's because it's been reported by the candidate, the PAC. The PAC then needs to amend their report to show that the money has been refunded. In the case of some candidates, they've said, we've never even deposited the money. It was sent back immediately, but it's being presented at the FEC in 2 ways. One as a receipt by the campaign and one as a disbursement by the PAC, and what you're seeing here is the disbursement by the PAC. But if you're seeing a tiny portion of money coming from PACs, it is not anything to get too breathless about. It is likely just that it hasn't been recorded as returned in the amendment by the PAC yet. Let's look now at, you can also, look at her contributions for top industries by the top 100. So if you're not seeing an industry in the top 20, you can pull down virtually the whole list. Now let's look at Sanders' top industries. So on his industries tab, you see here his top industries do not show securities and investment. So we're going to go up and pull down his top 100. And now you will see securities and investment showing up far down the list at $14,000. I do want to point out that when you are looking at, this is one way to look at it, but you can also go to top industries under influence and lobbying and look at it from the other perspective, from the perspective of the donor industry or interest group. And here, it allows you to, for instance, click on finance, insurance, and real estate, and then within that, to click on industry, securities, and investment. However, when you are looking at that, and you could look at money to Congress or recipients and pull down all senators, sorting by amount, by name, by state, you will see if securities and investment gave to a member of Congress, or you can look at it for all Senate candidates or all House candidates, it will be here. The important thing to note, however, is that when you are looking at it from the perspective of the industry and not on the campaign profile or the race profile, you are seeing only 2-year numbers. So for instance, for Elizabeth Warren or for Bernie Sanders, when you're looking at their profile, that includes the full 6-year term and will be different from the numbers that you see here. Whenever you're looking at our site and you see numbers that seem like they should be identical and they're not matching up, please look down at the bottom of the page. As I said before, there you will see important clarifying information. This covers only 2017-2008 election cycle, whereas on the member's profile for a senator, you would see that it covers a 6-year term, and it was downloaded last February 1. So we're about to update this information with a more recent download, and here again, if you're about to write a story, it's always worth a quick check to say, is this going to be the same, by this afternoon, or is it about to be updated? So you can email us again at press@crp.org to confirm when you see conflicting information or have any other questions. Expenditures are another unique way that CRP offers for you to look at the data. I think of expenditures kind of as inside baseball. Not everybody, I guess cares about as much about the haircuts and the wardrobes, but it is, I think, a reasonable way to understand how the campaigns are deploying their assets, whether they're husbanding their resources appropriately, and allows you to see how they are spending their money as compared to their competition. So here we are, Bernie Sanders, Expenditures tab. You can see quickly that his, in the last cycle at least, his expenditures focused on administrative, fundraising, and salaries. Interestingly, media is down a ways. Typically, a campaign will start out heavy with a heavy emphasis on administration and salaries and kind of getting their organization set up, and then shift to focusing on media expenses toward the election. In his case, that did not happen, but you should also note that a lot of these companies are very diversified. So they do media, they do strategy, they allow you to text your donation. It can be very, very difficult. Although I think we have the best categorization of each individual transaction for expenditures, not everything is classifiable, and we're very upfront and we'll provide you with the data about the background if you're seeking to get a sense of exactly what is included. Going back to Warren, by comparison, in the last cycle, media was her top expenditure with nearly $5 million. Nearly 28% of her funds were spent on media. And looking at their vendors, which is just below that, you see that Revolution Messaging was Bernie Sanders' #1 vendor. Revolution Messaging got a huge PR boost from his campaign. If you click on that link, it'll take you to a page of all of their other top clients and who tops the list. Oh, what a coincidence. Another candidate for the White House, Beto O'Rourke. Actually, this also signals kind of news reports have detailed the Revolution Messaging's implosion last cycle. Several Sanderistas bolted from Sanders to O'Rourke in 2018 and for the 2020 campaigns, and its staff created new firms like Middle Seat Consulting, kind of from the ashes of Revolution Messaging. So if you were to click on Beto O'Rourke, you'll see Revolution Messaging, but you'll also now see that he's tapped the remnants of that former firm, which has reconstituted itself. Warren, by contrast, if we look at her top vendors, is relying on Bully Pulpit. So more than $3 million, and you can dive in and see actually each transaction along with it. When you see these figures, be aware that they are at least figures. So this is based on our standardization. This is a huge data set, and we are doing our best to make sure that we are standardizing each and every donation so that you can group up and get the accurate picture. But there are certainly some cases in which you will see multiple or additional standardization that can be done. In any case, our expenditures expert is somebody you should be in contact with. His name is Andrew Mayerson, and if you have expenditures questions as well as outside spending questions, contact him directly at amayerson@crp.org. And again, this is on the sheet, which you will have. And then finally, speaking of outside spending, be aware that in addition to the outside spending section of our website, which is gives you huge numbers of resources, including the list of single candidate super PACs, how much is being spent by super PACs versus nonprofits, dark money organizations versus partially disclosing organizations, and tracking the outside spending by race and by candidate. You can explore these big picture trends as well as dive into the granular detail of super PACs, dark money, and gray money groups. In the case of Sanders and Warren, you can look at the Sanders profile and see here on other data exactly how much was spent by these outside groups. So scrolling down, it's at the bottom, and that is all that was spent in his race. $1.5 million from Future 45, but otherwise, and it was Arizonans for Affordable Electricity, oddly, but otherwise not a lot of money because this is not a competitive race, and their firepower is almost all targeting those opportunities for a pickup, of which Sanders did not represent one. And similarly, we have here for Warren, the data under the other data tab. You can get into that same, although she was also a target of the same committee, Future 45. You can get into that same information from, again, the opposite perspective by going to the outside spending section and looking at the race profiles or the candidate profiles. So we try to give you a number of ways to pivot back and forth between different profiles, whether it's the target of those funds, the candidates that are filing, or the outside groups that are filing. And again, you may see, depending on when the data was updated, fresher information on one page. Pay attention to the dates, and call us if you have questions. And I'll stop there.
Can I ask Sheila a quick question? One thing that I always kind of wonder, and I'm sure other people do too, is when it's the deadline to, so the next deadline for the quarter is April 15th, right? How quickly will you have that information? So not what you're talking about per se, but just the raw data, because it's always sort of confusing. It's easier to go here, but you have it obviously first. So what's the timing on that?
Great.
What do you suggest?
Yeah, great question. So on the day of a filing deadline, our reporters go to the FEC to constantly monitor who's filed most recently so that they can quickly do their own cherry picking. But for your information, our site is full of data of all kinds, and it's always on a rolling basis. Some of it is updated quite frequently. Other data may be updated only every few months. In terms of a new filing deadline for candidates, PACs, and parties, we update the summary information daily. So it'll be updated in the morning. If it's late in the afternoon, you may, on the filing deadline, will see new information at the FEC. We will update it again the following morning, and so on. Outside spending information is also grabbed daily, but we are constantly updating that hourly, in fact, on our website as our researchers standardize the outside spending groups. So that will continue to change, and if it is grabbed one morning, it'll be one thing in the morning and maybe entirely different right after a deadline in the afternoon. The painful part for us is that we have to take the itemized individual donations and PAC donations and run them through our processes to automate the classification and standardization as quickly as possible, but then we take additional time to manually improve that so that our data is as clean as possible before we upload that to the website. In terms of PACs, that data will go up in a matter of a few days, like 3 days after we grab it. In terms of individuals, the raw data is available on our donor lookup as it is at the FEC within a day or two, but the standardized individual donations that are grouped, aggregated in every member's profile and every race profile, in every industry profile, that we spend about a couple weeks on to clean and then eventually push to the website, and then the whole thing starts over again.
And the raw data, as I think you know, it gets posted almost immediately upon filing. Now that we have electronic filing for House and Senate and presidential, obviously, anybody who is raising or spending more than $50,000 has to file electronically, and that stuff just goes right up.
And we do not have expenditures searchable on our site. The FEC expenditures search is fantastic. What we do have is the aggregations by category and by entity that the FEC doesn't do.
And
So
I
Sheila,
think your
who's-
website is fantastic, too.
Who's the best person to check with on the veracity of your data, you know, how clean it is?
Well, you can always write press@crp.org, and that will go to our press team and our research director for quick questions. If you're on filing deadline and want to know exactly what's included, or want to know when a particular data set is next to be updated, that's probably the most efficient way because it goes to a team of people. And then if it's about expenditures or about personal finances or about something else, it'll be directed to the researcher that covers that data set.
Great, thank you. Now we'll use the remaining time for your questions. Maria, did you have something?
If you haven't forgotten it.
So, identify yourself.
Yeah, thank you for doing this. I'm Maria Pena. I'm now a freelance journalist because of the media landscape, unfortunately. But so my question had to do with something you said earlier about the big donors and how they basically they're in it to get something out of it. Obviously, they're not running a charity. So what about the little guys? And for instance, they contribute to unions that then contribute to political campaigns. So I was wondering if you could address the role of unions on the one hand. And the other hand, I remember back in December, there were two separate reports that were actually stunning because they talked about not only about the 2016 election interference, but the fact that they were trying to do it also for the midterms. They did for the midterms, and they're potentially trying again for the 2020 election. So what is the FEC doing, or for that matter, what's going on in terms of assuring that there are no foreigners, individuals or entities trying to influence U.S. elections through like sneaky ways, like, if foreigners are not allowed to make donations, are you seeing evidence that they're perhaps doing it through U.S. citizens or U.S. entities? In other words, what are you seeing that could be a potential red flag for the kinds of things that those two reports were warning about back in December?
Okay, people looking in my direction.
Can I just answer the first question about unions?
Absolutely.
I just want to point out that in our under election overview and source of funds, in terms of hard money and soft money going to the super PACs and outside spending groups, the vast majority of money, because we categorize it by industry and interest group, we also group up by business versus labor, ideological, and other organizations. And as you can see here, the light blue bar at the top is business contributions, affiliated contributions with the PAC or individual employees of a firm, or non-wage earning spouses, dependent children of someone who identifies as working at a particular interest. So the blue bar is business. It's kind of lurching 2 steps forward, 1 step back with each presidential and midterm election cycle. The yellow bar at the bottom is unions. So labor has really stagnated big time. It's giving $166.64 million in itemized donations that we can see, as opposed to $2.7 billion coming from business interests. Again, not just PACs, but individuals, individual employees as well. And some may question whether that's fair and appropriate to include individual donations. That's a topic of debate, but from my perspective, when we are fingerprinting these millions of donations, we're looking at not your rank and file employees, but people who have high-ranking positions in these corporations who have disposable income that they can use to, in some ways, shape politics.
And the typical union member is donating through a payroll deduction plan that, might be 50 cents per paycheck. So, I think Sheila is right. The comparison that you want to look at is unions versus corporations. And, corporations still have a whole lot more money at their disposal than unions do. It's kind of you hear that bandied about. It's like, oh, well, what about the role of the unions? They just do not have the economic firepower that corporations do, or that corporate CEOs do. If you look at the typical salary of a corporate CEO versus a typical union member, what I've been reading recently is that, that discrepancy has only been ballooning in the last couple of decades. But what are we doing about foreign influence? Short answer, not enough. The FEC has a limited portfolio on this, and there are other agencies, Homeland Security, and all of the secretaries of states who are all involved in different aspects of trying to protect against foreign influence. Our portfolio is limited to the money and politics side. But even on that, I am very concerned about money being spent by foreign citizens, by foreign governments in some cases, to try and influence our elections. I have thrown out to my colleagues, I've lost track of how many different proposals for rulemaking endeavors and other things that we could do. The only one that I've ever been able to get 4 votes to even launch is an ongoing effort to clarify our internet disclaimer rules so that when you see ads on the internet, it will be clear who's behind the ad. And even that has been kind of slow-walked recently, and I'm trying to get, I've received a letter recently from 24 members of the Senate saying, what's the schedule on this? When is this going to happen? And I'm trying to get a clear answer from my colleagues as to whether we're really going to go forward on even this very small slice or not. There's also opportunities through the enforcement track to look at things like the case that we recently resolved that I talked about earlier, but that's a much slower process. And the concern would be that somebody files a complaint today and, we still might not resolve it before the 2020 election. So that's not a very effective way of addressing the global and very serious problem of a concerted attack on our democracy by foreign governments.
Okay, anyone else want to weigh in? Okay, other questions? Yes, sir. Please identify yourself.
Yeah, Ken Doyle with Bloomberg Government. Sheila, and maybe other people want to address this, but I'm curious about the big increase in the last midterm versus the previous one, and whether would you go out on a limb and have a prediction for the upcoming election? That was 50% higher than the previous midterm record. What does that mean to you? Does that mean it's going to keep going up like that, 50% each time?
Of course, anything I would say would be pure conjecture. So take anything with a grain of salt. When we look at the past great leaps forward in spending, there have been a few as large as this. So we're looking at, again, $5.7 billion here for the top beige bar versus 3.8 in 2014. From 2010 to 2006, there was maybe a sizable leap, and here again from 2000 to 2004, so it's always climbing, it's always going in one direction. But I do think that we saw in 2018 such intense energy that translated not just in was translated not just in terms of contributions, but also as we saw new first-time candidates running, women, people of color running for office, and a surge again in the role of women donors, which still is pretty sad, given that they make up more than half of the population. But it is, I think, a sizable growth in women donors this cycle versus past cycles. So if that intensity continues, I don't see why, certainly it would match the two, nearly 7 billion, 5.7 billion of the 2016 election cycle. And I don't see why it wouldn't exceed it because many of the same, 6.5 billion spent in 2016. I don't see why it wouldn't exceed that because many of the same issues that propelled all of the intense money, fundraising, and intense interest in the 2018 cycle still exist.
I just wanted to add something, but more about the presidential. Donald Trump was the first president. On his inauguration day, he filed his paperwork to run for re-election, and what that did was allow him to raise money right away. So if you look back at the previous presidents in our lifetime and modern times, they all waited till year 3 to raise money for themselves. Well into year 3, so after the midterms. Donald Trump's raised millions in the first 2 years. So I was talking to someone with Team Trump recently who said we're the new model now. So every president they feel like is likely to go with that and start raising money those first 2 years. So if that's the case, that's going to increase the amount of money raised and spent.
Excellent point.
And they've raised about $68 million in the first 2 years. I also want to point out that it's a really interesting comparison point. When you look at 2018, the midterm, the natural comparison is to the previous midterm, which was 2014. 2014 was a particularly low energy midterm. I mean, midterms are all low energy, but that showed we had the lowest turnout in 70 years. In 2014. You'd have to go back to World War II when a whole bunch of voters were overseas fighting for democracy in an entirely different forum to find a lower turnout rate. 2018 had a rate that everybody celebrated and said, woohoo, we had the highest turnout rate in decades. It was still only about 50%. Because the midterms never seemed to inspire, even in a year where everybody seemed to be energized, the midterms just don't seem to inspire people to turn out and vote. So if you look at that, I think that shows that there is the potential for a great deal more activism than we've already seen in the midterms. And how that translates on the money front, nobody knows.
I'm glad Anita raised the point that President Trump began fundraising for his reelection immediately, because it reminded me of something I intended to mention in my opening remarks but did not, which is that I think President Trump is presently, and going back to December of 2016, January of 2017, committing a massive violation of federal campaign finance law in plain sight. He's doing something similar to what Jeb Bush did. And he began this process in December of 2016 when, out of a meeting at Trump Tower, he created a 501c4 dark money group called America First Policies. The reporting at the time was that Jared Kushner blessed, I think was the word that was used in the early reporting, blessed as the first head of this C4 dark money group Brad Parscale, who had been the digital director of the 2016 Trump campaign. And this group went public in January of 2017, announcing as its 6 co-founders 6 high-ranking members of the Trump 2016 campaign. Common Cause, I wrote, and we, Common Cause, filed complaints with the DOJ and the FEC on this last spring, I believe in March of 2018. And again, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, federal law prohibits any entity directly or indirectly established by a candidate or office holder from raising or spending any money outside of federal limits in connection with an election. I've raised this, I've pitched this story to reporters, hey, write about my complaint. And I get a couple of different responses pretty consistently. One is sort of skepticism that I'm right. This can't possibly be illegal because other people would be writing about it, which, I don't think that's a very valid response, but that's what I get. The other is just desensitization, I think, among journalists to these evolving campaign finance practices, because people remember in the back of their head, Jeb Bush had a super PAC, and Barack Obama had he spun a C4 social welfare group out of his campaign. But what distinguishes the Trump operation from the Obama operation was that the Obama operation did not spend any money in connection with elections. The Trump C4 started spending money immediately in 2017 on several federal special elections, and then was a major vehicle of campaign spending in the 2018 midterm elections, and will likely be a big player in Trump's reelection. All dark, unlimited money set up by a candidate for federal office. So I'd love to talk to you about that. Feel free to give me a call or grab me after this event, and we could chat about that some more.
Okay, any follow-up questions or other questions? Maria?
Yeah, so what you just said about the unlimited dark money, what's going, can you talk about what the current landscape is for campaign finance reform? I know that there's been some efforts to roll back some of the measures that had been adopted precisely to prevent that sort of scenario where you have all this unlimited dark money and, you know, who knows what else is going on underneath the surface?
Yeah, there are several provisions of H.R. 1 that I'm sure you're all familiar with. That there are a bunch of different campaign finance reform provisions in H.R. 1. H.R. 1 is really a collection of bills that have been introduced in recent years individually, separately. So you have Senator Klobuchar's Honest Ads Act, for example, which specifically targets or would result in more disclosure for online political advertising. Many of these reforms are being pursued. Some have actually been enacted at the state level. The state of Maryland enacted a campaign finance disclosure law modeled on the Honest Ads Act, and the Washington Post promptly sued the state of Maryland, and that case is still being litigated in federal court because the Washington Post and a few other newspapers in Maryland sell political advertising on their websites. And as a result of that sale of political advertising on their websites, this is not on the journalism side, this is on the revenue generation ad selling side, they would have to collect some information from the ad buyers and make it available to the public and to the state of Maryland. They're opposed to doing that. So there are also within H.R. 1 provisions that would strengthen the laws around interaction between candidates and outside groups, what election lawyers and FEC commissioners refer to as the coordination rules or anti-coordination rules. It is allowable, due to an FEC interpretation of some governing statutes, it is allowable for a federal candidate or office holder to attend or speak or be a featured guest at a super PAC fundraising event, even though they're not allowed under the law, clearly, to set up a super PAC or ask for money in excess of the candidate contribution limit for super PACs. So they can be pretty closely aligned with super PACs and other outside unlimited money groups, C4 dark money groups. The FEC, in my view, allowed some of that didn't necessarily need to be allowed, and I think Chair Weintraub has a different view on that, but that would be addressed to some extent in H.R. 1. Public financing provisions in H.R. 1 is another campaign finance reform in that package. Unfortunately, H.R. 1 isn't going to get through Mitch McConnell in this Senate. So advocates, Common Cause, we're strong proponents of H.R. 1. We're looking at it as a 3, 4, 5, 6-year campaign to pass that package.
It took 7 years on McCain-Feingold. If anybody's really interested in the history of our solicitation rules and why and how they evolved, and believe me, I'm not satisfied with the result either, I'd be happy to get into it with you. It's a sidebar because it's long and obscure and arcane. But one thing that I completely agree with Paul on is that our coordination rules are inadequate to deal with the current landscape. We have not updated them since Citizens United, and they were not written for the super PAC world because the super PACs didn't exist. So there has never been a rulemaking by the FEC on exactly what candidates can and can't do in a world of single candidate super PACs and how close they can get to them without crossing the line into coordination, which would make everything that the super PAC is doing into one gigantic, excessive, illegal contribution. So that's a big problem, that we have not been able to launch that rulemaking. You know, this is another thing that suffers from the political will at the FEC, not for lack of trying, let me assure you. Well, I'll just stop.
Yeah, but I think it's worth remembering that the Citizens United Court made two promises. I think of these as, and talk about these as, the two unfulfilled promises of the Citizens United Court. Number one, the court said, we're going to unleash unlimited corporate money into U.S. elections, and by extension, unlimited money, period, into federal elections. But the two promises, number one, don't worry, this money will all be totally independent of candidates, so it can't corrupt them. And number two, don't worry, it'll all be disclosed. It'll all be transparent, so the American people can hold the corporate donors responsible if they see undue access or influence, et cetera. We knew at the time that, I was involved in litigating Citizens United. It was predictable the laws on the books were not up to snuff. They would not protect or result in true independence, and they would not produce the disclosure. So the court's majority was either disingenuous or naive when it made these assurances and rested its opinion on these assurances. And neither of those two characteristics, being disingenuous or naive, are desirable ones in Supreme Court justices. But that's what it was all. It was predictable the way Citizens United would play out.
I completely agree with that. It's, and let me assure you that there were rulemaking efforts at the FEC almost immediately after Citizens United that would have addressed, we were drafting proposals on coordination, on disclosure, in light of what it said in Citizens United, and after months of going back and forth on the language in proposed notice of rulemaking, the Republicans shot it down and said, no, we're not doing any of that. And we have been unable to launch a rulemaking that would have addressed it. Since then, the law that people rely on has emerged as a result of some advisory opinions that are not, in my view, they are not strong enough to prevent actual, what anybody would consider to be coordination in any common sense meaning of the word between candidates and super PACs. I think the relationship is much too close to, because remembering that Citizens United was premised on this notion that it couldn't possibly corrupt the candidate because the candidate would be operating totally independent of the super PAC. So it wouldn't matter that millions of dollars were going into the super PAC because that would have nothing to do with the candidate. Well, query whether it makes sense from the get-go to say that, if you give more than $3,000 to the candidate, that's going to be corrupting and that's illegal and that's a bad thing. But you could give $3 million to a super PAC and that's doing nothing but promoting the interests of that candidate, and that can't possibly corrupt the candidate. There's no way. I mean, who believes that in the real world? I think this is part of why the public at large is so cynical about the framework that we're operating under right now. But even if you take them at their word that, and you accept that much of it, that, that as long as it's independent, $3 million aren't going to be corrupting, it's got to be truly independent. And the relationships between the candidates and the super PACs, I think, don't really meet that test. But I, once again, cannot get 4 votes at the FEC to adopt stronger rules.
Okay, other questions? Yes, over here.
Zach Monoy with Politico. Commissioner, you said recently that since you can't get a lot of votes on a lot of things, you're not going to allow the FEC to defend itself in court. Has that made any movement among your colleagues, or is it kind of ignored?
Well, I don't want to speak for my colleagues, but and just to be clear, to give a little context for those who aren't familiar with what you're talking about, the way it works is, let's assume we split on a decision and we therefore do not investigate, do not come up with any penalties for conduct that is alleged to be illegal. People can then sue us. But the way the law is set up is it takes 4 votes to authorize defense of that lawsuit. And as a matter of norms, there have always been those 4 votes. Now, I have not, this isn't brand new for me to be not voting to defend litigation. What is newer is that I've announced that I'm not going to vote to defend decisions by my colleagues not to enforce the law. It's not a blanket statement. It's just, and it's a case-by-case analysis. And now there's only 4 commissioners, so if I don't vote to defend the litigation, there won't be 4 votes to defend the litigation. Has this had an effect. I think maybe it's making them a little bit nervous, but have I seen any concrete effects of this? Not so far, but we'll see. I mean, wait till somebody sues us and we don't know what will happen when somebody sues us and they show up in court and there's nobody on the other side to defend the agency.
Let me get on that.
Any other questions?
Can I just chime in since
Sure.
nobody's asking questions to say, in addition to all of the concern about foreign donors and straw donors, which are, long been concern. In fact, we've been to this road. This is not our first time at the rodeo. We've done the foreign donor scandal circuit back in the mid-90s. So my view on foreign donors is they have the willingness, they have the wherewithal, and now that the rules are that much more lax and enforcement is that much more lax, why on earth would we expect anything different than what we've seen in the past? But also, of course, in addition to the concern about foreign money coming in through non-disclosing LLCs, shell corporations, and non-disclosing nonprofits, we have the tandem concern of foreign entities trying to influence the election through money spent to disinform, to sow animus and division. And of course, that can be measured in part by examining the political advertising on social media. So we are working with Wesleyan Media Project to continue to add value to the tracking that they're doing on broadcast and increasingly on online advertising. We are also working with them and other organizations to ingest the ad archive from Facebook, from Twitter, and from Google to make it a more complete data set. Of course, that doesn't include, won't necessarily include everything, but it will give us an important other window on potential foreign meddling in our elections. And of course, there's money being invested to influence that, and we think that's an important kind of other side of that influence buying coin.
And I think there's a role for the media in helping to draw attention to this issue, that you don't always know where the information is coming from. And, I mean, it sounds silly, but, you can't trust everything you read on the internet. I think people need to be reminded of that, because not only can't you trust it, but it, may be inadvertently inaccurate, but it may also be maliciously intended to harm our democracy. And people really ought to pay closer attention to where the information is coming from.
Well, I have a question for Ellen, and that is, how does the FEC calculate the fines for violations? On Twitter there was some criticism of the fine for the Ted Cruz Ted Cruz campaign violation.
A lot of factors go into it. It's related to the amount in violation. It's related to the kind of conduct at issue. It's related to cooperation of if people are cooperative with us once the complaint is filed, or if they file sua spontes, that can have an effect on the amount of the penalty. We don't make public all of the calculations that go into it, but there's a lot of different factors.
Can I piggyback on that? I'm just curious, I don't know when the filing for the Jeb Bush thing happened, or when that was.
Ask him, he filed it.
Yeah, when was that?
March 31st, 2015. We were timing it to try to get in some April 1st.
Okay, so
headlines.
it's 2019. Doesn't it, first of all, I don't really understand why it takes that long. So maybe you can explain that. Maybe that's a silly question. But the other thing is, doesn't it lose teeth if Jeb Bush has gone away and retired and he's not running again? I mean, shouldn't the cases be resolved within the cycle, or do they not have as much impact?
Okay, so I have to be careful what I say here because I cannot comment on any
Okay.
particular open matter. However, as a general matter, I am deeply concerned about the amount of time that cases take. I completely agree with you, and I've said so publicly, that cases should be resolved within an election cycle. I mean, what frequently happens is that we will get a lot of complaints in the few weeks leading to the election. And there's no way that we could actually conduct investigations and complete all that before the election. That's just never going to happen. However, we definitely should have them completed before the next election, I think. The statute contemplates some kind of action within 120 days. And there have been some court decisions on this that have held us, frankly, to a pretty low bar on that, and have said, well, you assign a lawyer, you're taking some kind of action. I think we could be more ambitious than that. I think one problem has been that we now have more cases than we have ever had since the time we started counting cases in-house, and we have fewer lawyers to deal with them, and that has been a strategic effort by some of my colleagues to not fill positions and to not allow, we could use another whole team of enforcement attorneys, and I have asked for that. I'm willing to go up to the Hill to ask for more money for it, but there are ways we could use some of the money that's available to us now, and I have not been able to get agreement from my colleagues who do not want to hire more enforcement attorneys, so that's part of the problem. There have been, no, I mean, seriously, I mean, I put some charts up at the last meeting of the year, I think it was last year. We've got over 300 cases in-house. That's a huge increase over what we had 10 years ago. And we're dealing with 2/3 the legal staff that we used to have. So, I mean, you can do math. You can figure out this just isn't going to work. Plus, there has been an ongoing problem of commissioners unwilling to vote on matters for one reason or another and just holding them up. And we can't move forward on cases that commissioners are unwilling to vote on. And I think that is a very serious problem. But I have, other than naming and shaming, I have very limited abilities to force my colleagues to do the work and take the votes and make the decisions. And then, put it out there. And if, they can write a statement defending their point of view, and people can sue us if they disagree, and we'll see how it goes in court.
And another provision of H.R. 1, getting back to that question, would completely restructure the FEC.
But but let me say about that, the problem with the FEC is not that we have, a split in, it's an even number and there's a split and therefore we can't make decisions. If we had an odd number, we could make decisions that just might be very bad decisions. So, I mean, I could break the gridlock problem by simply voting with the Republicans. Then we would always have a majority, enough vote. Well, we wouldn't right now because there's only 4 of us. But assuming we had a fully stocked commission of 3 and 3, and I just voted with the Republicans all the time because they always vote together, that would make a majority vote for everything. I don't think that you would like that result very much. I know I wouldn't like that result very much. The problem isn't gridlock, it's obstruction of enforcement of the law. And that, now there is a provision in H.R. 1 about the FEC that I think would help with that, and that is that we have to change the way commissioners are appointed. We have to change the process of that, and I was appointed the same way, don't get me wrong, but right now commissioners are handpicked by the very people that we are going to be regulating. That's not a good system. That is just not a good system. So now ultimately, the president is going to have to nominate and the Senate's going to have to confirm. It's hard to get out of that aspect of it, but one could move to a system based on, you have some kind of blue ribbon commission that forwards names and then the president has to pick from amongst those names. Some people have argued that, well, that just then somebody would have to appoint the members of the Blue Ribbon Commission, so you're just, moving the problem to a different place, maybe. But I think the more distance that you get, if you could get some distance between the very people who are being regulated and the choice of who's going to regulate them, then that would be a good thing. But, there's also been a problem that has been particularly exacerbated in the last 10 years of commissioners who have an ideological opposition to campaign finance regulation at all. So, and some of those folks are being, some people with that ideological bent are being appointed to the courts, which is also going to have an impact on whether, even if we were to completely restructure the FEC, ultimately we would be able to enforce the law properly.
Thank you. And thank you so much to all of the panelists, and thank you to Diane and to Crystal for helping make this happen. Thank you all for being here. And I want to also mention, you may have noticed, especially people sitting closer, that our panelists are wearing pins that say Free Austin Tice. So I want to tell everybody a little bit about Austin, if you don't know. Austin is an American journalist who was detained 2,408 days ago while reporting in Syria for McClatchy and the Washington Post. The U.S. government believes Austin is alive and is working very hard to bring him home. Austin's family has been fighting for his freedom for almost 7 years. And we stand with them, and we hope that you will too. If you would like a pin, let me know, and I will give you one. You can also see some of Austin's photography from Syria out in the lobby, and you'll see information there about Night Out for Austin, which will be May 2nd. There are restaurants participating, Zaytina's, and all the Hanks restaurants, Pizza Paradiso, and many others that are donating a portion of their proceeds to increase the FBI reward to more than $1 million for information leading to his safe return. So please join us in participating in that way as well, and in any other way that you can in supporting Austin and his family. And thank you all again for being here today.
And the panelists are available for any questions now, if you like.
And I also want to thank all of you for being here and for the work that you do, because our democracy depends on your hard work on a vibrant and independent free press. So thank you.
Hear, hear.
Yes.
Thank you for coming.